Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the depth psychology of the great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. With me is Dr. Leanne Whitney, who is the author of Consciousness in Jung and Patanjali. She is also a transformational filmmaker and a transformational life coach, and she teaches yoga philosophy for yoga teachers in Southern California. Welcome, Leanne.
Thank you, Jeff. Nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. And to talk about Carl Jung, who is, by many people consider Jung perhaps one of the 2 or 3 greatest thinkers of the 20th century. And of course, he built on the work of Sigmund Freud, and the two of them had a very interesting relationship.
Very interesting. And actually, the rift between Freud and Jung, I would say, still reverberates today. Mm-hmm. It's one of the legacies of psychology in the West that we still really haven't gotten a grip on. You know, their relationship was seen as many things: homoerotic, Judaism versus non-Judaism, scientism versus spiritualism, and they couldn't seem to come to terms on a few things, and there was a big schism, and that schism is still alive and well today.
Freud was something of a father figure to Jung, I believe.
That's right, yes. So there was a father-son dynamic as well, absolutely.
Yeah. But I guess the key point is that Sigmund Freud pioneered the idea in psychology of the unconscious, not that he invented it, but that he really popularized it.
Absolutely. And Jung was right on his tail, so to speak, that there was an objective psyche and that there would be empirical means to look into the psyche.
Yeah. And Jung, for a while, was considered Freud's protege, the person who would likely succeed Freud as the leader of the psychoanalytic movement.
Absolutely, and I think that's why the rift was something that was so significant for the whole movement itself, and absolutely for Jung in particular. He went through many, many years after that split trying to find a ground and trying to find a voice from which he would then sort of rise again.
In fact, he went through a phase that some have described as a period of mental illness himself. Yeah,
creative illness. It's often referred to as that, like shamans or, shamanistic creative illnesses. They compare it to that often, yeah.
Now, both Freud and Jung had an interest in the paranormal.
That's right. Absolutely. The Psychical Research Society? They both belong to that, yes.
They both belong to the Society for Psychical Research,
that's right.
Founded in 1882 in London.
Yes.
And I think at one point Freud wrote that if he could toward the end of his life, he said, if I could do it all over again, I would be focusing in on the occult, on parapsychology.
I've never heard that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
And Jung's doctoral dissertation was about mediumship.
That's right. Oh, yes. Jung was definitely into investigating psychic phenomena. I mean, his mother absolutely had psychic gifts. So he grew up in a household where there was some level of interest, for sure, in tapping into other realms.
And on the other hand, Freud, I guess, encouraged by some of his other disciples, I believe, made a strategic decision to back away from that in order to establish psychoanalysis as a scientific discipline.
Yes, that's right. So as I was speaking about earlier, that schism had to do with, is it a hardcore science? Is there spiritualism involved in it? And Jung wanted to go towards the spiritual aspects, the soul. And as we see today with Freudian psychoanalysis, neuroscience is very popular. So still that rift survives. Is it neuroscience? Is it the soul? And we're still trying to find our way back, I think.
Well, and when Freud looked at the unconscious mind, what he saw primarily were the repressed emotions that civilization wouldn't tolerate, sexual drives, aggressive urges. Jung saw something very different in the unconscious.
That's right. He saw more of a collective unconscious. He saw mythological motifs and archetypal appearances that across epochs and generations that seem to reappear often. And Freud hadn't tapped into that.
So Jung, when he began to try and describe this collective unconscious and even the personal unconscious, he began to explore the world's spiritual traditions to find a foundation for his study.
That's right, and he studied a lot. He studied alchemy, he studied Buddhism, he studied Taoism, he studied yoga psychology. And in that, he found a sort of parallel to his psycho-spiritual spiritual development of the personality.
Now, in your book, Consciousness in Jung and Patanjali, you use the term science to describe, actually, I think both psychoanalysis and Jungian depth psychology.
Yes. It's an empirical science of the unconscious, according to Jung. That is what he set out to, him and Freud set out to postulate and put in front of us,
Many people today regard neither of these two traditions as being empirically scientific by our current standards.
That's true. That is very true. But those two men absolutely felt that we could use dreams, parapraxis, symptoms, and find a means of highlighting the objective psyche, if you will.
Now, what is a parapraxis?
It slips of the tongue. So when you say something by accident, but it's really on purpose from the bigger scheme of things.
Well, Freud wrote a brilliant book about that, the psychopathology of everyday life.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
And Jung was also looking at word association tests as a window into the unconscious.
That's right. When he was younger at the Brogoszli Psychiatric Hospital, he developed a test of word association because he had tapped into what he wants to call a complex, or what he did call a complex. It's thoughts, emotions, memories that are all tied around some long-held, let's say, psychic wound or a trauma in the psyche. And he noticed that when he gave a word, the responses were not arbitrary.
No, if I understand it correctly, typically if the word triggered an association that was connected to a painful wound, the subject or patient wouldn't respond immediately. They'd think about it. Should I really say that? And they might come up with a second choice instead, rather than revealing their inner pain. And so it took longer for them to respond to the word association test.
That's right. There was a gap in the response, and that's what really intrigued Jung. He was like, what's going on here?
So he began developing a genuine empirical approach to looking at unconscious dynamics.
Absolutely. That was one of his ways of doing it. And affect became really symbolic for him and for Freud. He noticed that there was a lot of affect involved when these complexes got stimulated.
And something else you emphasize in your work is the concept of the self in Jungian psychology.
Sure. Well, that was very big for Jung, the archetype of the self, which for him was the archetype of the God image. And in his individuation process, which is his word for the psycho-spiritual development of the personality, it's the ego's finding its relationship to this archetype of the self that's all important in this growth, in this spiritual development.
Now, you've used the word archetype, and it's very common in today's parlance. But Jung really, I think, is the person responsible for introducing that term into our vocabulary.
I think so. In psychology, yes, that and complexes. And those two go together. Archetypes are at the affective core of complexes for Jung. They go hand in hand for him.
And I have to say, I have interviewed many people about what is an archetype, and everybody gives me a different definition.
Should I try to give you? Okay.
Yeah, what's yours?
Well, I'll give you the Jungian definition, or the way that I interpret Jung having defined it. They're imprints. So archetypos is an imprint. But also it's sort of like the pattern in biology, sort of like a bird can build a nest or a chick will break out of an egg. It's these inherited patterns of behavior, just like we would have inherited patterns of behavior in biology, but they're in the psyche. So he also calls it instinct, like he makes a parallel to instinct with it.
But then archetypes are linked to various mythological dynamics.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I feel like you can see that in the Eastern traditions as well, particularly in Mahayana Buddhism, when they talk about the Tathagata Garbha, like the Buddha seed. It's like an psychic imprint.
Okay, well, I know we're going to do another interview on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and we'll get more into Eastern tradition, but what you're saying is that we're born with these potential archetypes.
Yes, we're born with, they're innate, absolutely.
Or I should say archetypal potentials.
Yes, they're absolutely innate in us.
It's part of what makes us human.
Absolutely, psychologically, yeah.
And some of these archetypes, for example, would be the mother.
Absolutely, the mother archetype. And for instance, if a child is abandoned early on and orphaned, they may have this complex that develops around the mother archetype.
So the process of Jungian individuation, which we could call, the Jungian equivalent of spiritual enlightenment even, involves integrating the deep self with the ego.
That's right. They develop a dialogic relationship.
A dialogic relationship.
Yes.
That's beautiful.
They never actually, in Jungian psychology, they never stop that dialogue. It's ongoing. And
so the ego one might think of as the persona, the surface personality.
Well, there's definitely the persona for sure. In Jungian psychology, there's the persona. But he does speak of the ego as different. The ego is actually the seat of consciousness for Jung, and that's a very important point when we go to compare him.
The conscious observer.
Just consciousness in general is associated with an ego for Jung.
Waking consciousness.
Yes, consciousness.
Well, consciousness is a funny word. Like, I think that I lose consciousness when I go to sleep at night, but some people would say, no, you don't really lose it. It's still there somewhere.
That's right. Well, in the East, they would say that, but for Jung, it is. You're right. It's the waking consciousness. Anything associated to the ego would be conscious for him. If it's not associated to an ego, for Jung, it falls into the schema of his unconscious.
And so Jung has this idea that there is, you called it an archetype, the archetype of the self.
Yes.
Which, as I understand Jungian thought, that's also equivalent to the Godhead archetype.
Yes, absolutely. It's the archetype of the God image. And it's a mysterium tremendum. It has a lot of power, a lot of numinous potential, if you will.
So, in essence, then, Jung is saying that the process of individuation is about becoming conscious of the inner God.
He is saying that, absolutely. And he puts God in the psyche. That is actually his great interest, was to say that God experience is directly available to humankind, and it's available in the psyche.
And his mentor, Freud, his father figure Freud, was basically an atheist.
That's right, he was. Yeah. And again, that's part of where they separated ways.
They had both. I know Freud had a deep interest in religion. He wrote the book Moses and Monotheism. He felt that religion had a big impact on the subconscious mind, but Jung was the son of a religious pastor, and although he didn't subscribe to his father's beliefs, he must have been deeply influenced by the religious household in which he was raised.
That's right, because it wasn't just his father. His extended family, actually, there was a lot of pastors in Jung's family, and it was the Swiss Reformed Church, a branch of Protestantism that he was involved in. And it greatly impacted him, but not just being a pastor's son simply, it was the way his father actually experienced religion that also impacted Jung greatly. He didn't notice his father having the direct experiences, and the ability to articulate them,
Yeah.
and that sort of caused Jung to have a little bit of discomfort, if not a lot of discomfort, in his youth.
He saw his father as a person who was mouthing religious platitudes without having experienced the essence of what he considered a true religious revelation.
That's right. For Jung, it had to be known directly. It wasn't going to come through books.
Mm-hmm. So this is where Jungian psychology has departed from Freud and pretty much from, I guess you have to say, all of Western academic psychology.
Contemporary psychology, yes, because psychology years ago, decades ago, century ago, was about the soul. Yeah. And then it became a science of the mind. Mm-hmm. And so Jung did the best that he could to try to bring the soul back into psychology.
Well, I think it's fascinating when you consider that Jung left behind an enormous body of work, just like Freud. I mean, his collected works would fill a whole bookshelf.
Yes.
And he's regarded, as we mentioned earlier, as one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. He's had an enormous influence culturally and on the arts, and there have been movies about him. There's no doubt of his influence, and yet, if you go into a college campus, well, they may have his books in the library, but there are no courses on Jung, or very few. I know you do have a doctoral degree in Jungian depth psychology, but that's rare. It's very rare.
It is very, not as rare as a doctorate in parapsychology.
It's even more rare.
Right. But absolutely, it's absolutely very rare. He's been completely marginalized, deemed a mystic, and not accepted into the rigors of the academy. Absolutely.
And yet he regarded his work as scientific. And I want to come back to that because most people would probably say, people educated in the Western mode of empirical science, they would say there's nothing about Jungian psychology that matches the requirements of what we think of as empirical science today.
It's true, Jeff, but when we're talking about consciousness, it becomes a very gray area because to study consciousness, you have a hard time finding those objective measures. And really, even though depth psychology is an empirical science of the unconscious, without a doubt, since its inception, it has been very concerned with consciousness. And consciousness studies has become very big today. And I would be surprised if Jung doesn't have some sort of resurgence because of the field of consciousness studies.
Oh, I think you're correct. I would imagine that every decade, in fact, I go further, every century, I think Jung will become more respected and more well-known. His work is extremely profound. And the point I was trying to make actually is I think that Jung was building upon the notion of empiricism that William James wrote about before he died when he talked about radical empiricism. And I think you mentioned that yourself in your writing.
I do, in reference to Patanjali more so than Jung. But yes, I think Jung was getting there. I don't think he was there by any stretch of the word, but I definitely think he was getting there.
But the idea is, if I gather, that the therapist is observing the client or patient in therapy, making notes. The patient is free associating, talking about their dreams, talking about their unconscious mentation, their visionary experiences, and so on. And William James would say that this is empirical because it is the most intimate, immediate form of direct experience.
And it's true. And when we actually observe the world from the place of wholeness first, and the co-arising in one unified field, it's very empirical in that sense, because you're in the field observing what's happening. That's where the radical nature of it comes about.
Now, co-arising of one unified field, can you elaborate on that?
The phenomena would be co-arising. Co-arising in the therapist, in the client. They're in a field where there's a mutuality, a synchronicity, if you will. So the phenomena is co-arising. That's what I mean.
Now you use the term synchronicity, another very popular phrase in contemporary culture, and that's a term that was also introduced by Jung.
Absolutely true, yes. He did. He popularized that term.
Can you define it?
Synchronicity is acausal connectedness. So events, there is no causation between the events. It's an event that appears to happen in the mind, but also happens in the external world.
Mm-hmm. And there's several classical examples that are in the Jungian literature.
Yes, especially the scarab beetle is probably the most famous. One of Jung's clients had come with a dream. She had about a beetle, and the closest thing in Europe to that beetle appeared at the window behind Jung as his client was recounting her story.
Sort of tapping at the window
Yes.
while the client is explaining a dream involving the Egyptian scarab.
Yes, that's right.
And which is a way of sort of highlighting the significance of the dream.
And the moment, and that everything, the enormity of that moment, because what Jung was trying to communicate to his clients about God being present in the psyche, the impact of a moment that's synchronistic presents a wall up. You see what I'm saying? Instead of trying to describe it, then the client now has that mysterium tremendum, has that big experience.
It's as if the universe itself is participating in the therapeutic process.
I would say the universe definitely is participating.
Which is a very unique insight and one that confounds any other school of psychology or science.
That's right. That's right. It's more science is looked at as subject-object. It's very separate, as if we could really make a boundary, a demarcation between the subject and object. Now again, Jung did subscribe to empirical measures, but he did it very loosely. He knew that quantum physics was arising. He was friends with Wolfgang Pauli. He understood that the observer and the observed, that there was something going on there that we didn't understand yet.
Yeah. And Wolfgang Pauli, a Nobel laureate physicist, one of the founders of quantum physics, was an associate of Jung's. As I recall, when Jung published his book on synchronicity, it included an essay by Pauli.
That's right. They were very close. They worked together for a long time. Jung analyzed Pauli's dreams for a quite extended period of time.
And Pauli was also very interested in this subject-object dichotomy and what its implications for physics and for an understanding of reality itself.
That's right. For the understanding of reality itself.
Yeah. I gather Pauli also fell in love with one of Jung's clients.
Yes. Marie-Louise von Franz. Well, yes, she was a client of Jung's maybe at the beginning, but she was more his associate. They worked closely together.
Yeah, and she authored many books herself on
absolute scholar.
Depth psychology.
Yes.
So it's interesting. I did many years ago an interview on the psychology of dreaming, the dreaming universe, with the physicist Fred Alan Wolf, and he pointed out that in Pauli's depth psychoanalysis with Marie-Louise von Franz, I believe, he had a series of dreams that attempted to answer this question about the relationship between the subjective self and the objective world. And in the dream, it came out very specifically that the complex numbers, sometimes called the imaginary numbers, formed a the term is not isomorphic, just the opposite of, they existed in a plane perpendicular to the regular number plane, and that represented the realm of consciousness.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a very fascinating chapter, the relationship between Pauli and Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz.
And I believe also at the end of Pauli's life, in his hospital room, there was a specific number that was on his door, and I think there had been some distance between him and Jung at that time, and Jung was the first person he wanted to reach out to and connect with.
Now, Pauli, since we're talking about it, he seemed to be the kind of person who attracted synchronicities.
He did, and he also attracted what was called the Pauli effect.
Yes, which could be thought of as a synchronistic effect. That's just what I was thinking of. Can you elaborate on that?
I believe actually it was more when he walked into a room, if there was some sort of there would be an extra effect, or say a beaker would break open.
Yeah, equipment would break.
Yeah, exactly.
And on one occasion, as I recall the story, Niels Bohr in his laboratory in Copenhagen was conducting an experiment. Everything stopped working, and Niels Bohr remarked in an offhand way, it must be that Pauli's in town. And in fact, Pauli was at that moment passing through Copenhagen on a train.
Those are great stories.
Yeah. So the notion of synchronicity really sets Jungian psychology apart from other approaches to psychology.
I believe so, absolutely. Synchronicity in and of itself, again, is really representative of this idea of an underlying unity. So we're no longer on the outside trying to look the subject and the object on the outside. We're really more internal. Jung had this term called the psychoid. It's when the psyche in physics, you couldn't tell the boundary anymore. They sort of dissolved into the same thing. So that's where Jung was going in the later part of his life.
Now, the other interesting thing to me about Jungian psychology is his emphasis on alchemy. You started out by pointing out earlier, he studied enormously the religious traditions of the world. He was acquainted with the I Ching, with the Tibetan Book of the Dead, with the Yoga Sutras, with Taoism, with the Western Hermetic and esoteric traditions, and he felt ultimately that the system that best described what he was observing in the unconscious of his patients was alchemy.
Yes.
Medieval alchemy.
That's right. That was the closest mirror for Jung to his psychospiritual development of the personality. And he felt that alchemy did some things that his religion wasn't doing, which was answering the questions of matter, answering the questions of the feminine. Those two questions in particular were very, very important to Jung. In alchemy, he found a resolution to that.
Now, many people think of alchemy as sort of a pseudoscience in which charlatans attempted to bilk money out of innocent people by pretending to convert lead into gold. Jung saw it very differently.
That's right. He again, his psychospiritual development of the personality was God, showing itself in man, or man becoming God, becoming God realized. And so there was a real transformation of the psyche happening for Jung himself and also with his clients. And that was considered by him to be very alchemical.
So he saw alchemy as less a question of chemistry and more of a psycho-spiritual process in which the alchemist is attempting to convert the lead in his soul or in his psyche to something more valuable.
That's right, and the alchemist becomes the client, the person that takes on this process of individuation, takes the unconscious contents, the shadow, if you will, and sits with it until it arises into consciousness. Jung has this phrase also, he talks about the transcendent function, and it's the looking for the third, looking for something else to arise. So you cook it in the alchemical vessel until a new symbol, a new image emerges. So for Jung, the God image was constantly transforming, and that's what we're looking for in the individuation process.
And Jung was also very critical of Christianity, as I recall. In his book Answer to Job, he seems to suggest that the Trinity, the Godhead archetype of traditional Christianity was incomplete because it lacked the feminine.
Very much so. And that the feminine was very important to Jung, and he tries to bring it in many times through his psychology, definitely through the alchemy. Alchemy has the masculine and feminine together in a powerful union, the conjunctio. And then Jung worked a lot with nature herself. I mean, he would sit by the banks of the river near where he lived, and nature, so the feminine was very important to him in his work.
Now, another thing that you emphasize in your book on consciousness in Jung and Patanjali is that it's important to look at the social milieu that gave birth to these important movements, psychoanalysis and depth psychology, that this occurred at the end of the Victorian era, when society was going through enormous transformation technologically, and also was very male-dominated.
That's right. And also that all came on the heels of the Enlightenment, where there was the great schism between science and religion. Yeah. So it was just one century after another that greatly, I believe, impacted Jung, and he wanted to find, the healing modality for these ills at that time.
And one of the main illnesses that was appearing everywhere was what was known as hysteria.
In women, in particularly in European women, there was hysteria evolving quite strongly. And Freud also worked with hysterics, and Charcot and Genet. I mean, a lot of the old hypnotists were working actually with these women.
It was the pathology du jour.
It was the pathology. That's a good way to put it. That's right. And what these psychologists and neuroscientists were finding was that we have emotional life that leads a parasitic existence outside our normal field of awareness. And it became very important that to this research, that in the nervous system of these women, something was looking to express itself. And when they could go back and cathect the old wound, if you will, the traumatic memory, then a healing could come forward.
Now, and let's define hysteria, because it doesn't exactly mean that people go hysterical.
No, but they have a hard time trying to fit in with the social structure of their day. Yeah. So there's much discontent. We could call it a neurosis, I think. Yeah, there's much discontent.
And today, I don't even think hysteria is part of the official diagnostic language in psychiatry or psychology.
Yeah, and the DSM, I'm not familiar with that, but probably not.
I think they got rid of the term. But, and in fact, to my understanding, the symptoms that were reported so commonly amongst women around the turn of the 20th century, that is from the 19th to the 20th century, those symptoms don't seem to be so prevalent anymore.
Oh, I think they are pretty prevalent, because a lot of it is anxiety. A lot of it is anxiety. A lot of it is withheld emotion. I would say it's trauma held in the, actually, if we could distill it, I would call it trauma held in the body. We're just naming it something different. And I believe a lot of people still absolutely.
You think mostly women?
No, I think men are carrying it as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, my sense is that one of the big changes since the early days of psychoanalysis and Jungian psychology is that women have become more liberated. They're not in the Western society, they're out in the workforce when they weren't so much at that time. They have many more options, and that the early symptoms of hysteria, I presume, and maybe I'm wrong, had a lot to do with the way in which women were repressed in the Victorian era.
I might tweak that a little bit and say it's the way the feminine is repressed in general. So perhaps it could be seen specifically as that repression in that era, but still the feminine voice is very much repressed in our culture. And what Jung also did, which paved the way, was to really break past a lot of convention. And we live, right, in a capitalistic society that it's 9 to 5. A lot of natural instincts are repressed for men and women, Euro-American men and women. And we could say the spontaneity and, being outdoors, not being in a lighted cement brick building. Those are the aspects of the feminine that Jung was really trying to point us to.
In other words, our industrial society is so very, very different from the environment in which human beings evolved.
That's right. And perhaps a very unnatural society, which is making the psyche sick. And therefore, there's trauma there. And
both Freud and Jung reported that what was known as talk therapy seemed to be effective in curing these symptoms.
It did seem to be effective in curing the symptoms, yes. And I believe it still is, but we do have to go even further. I think we have to look a lot deeper into the Euro-American culture and really own a lot of what you alluded to earlier when you said the patriarchy, the male dominance. Colonialism was big, right? We still do go in and take resources in other countries when we want, when we see fit. And all the psyches of all Euro-American men and women are embedded in that, if you want to call it an ideology, but that social structure.
I guess as a psychologist, I might look at it this way, that to the extent that we participate, even indirectly, in the exploitation of other people, we defend ourselves psychologically by numbing ourselves, or numbing our psyche to the pain of the people who are the victims of either ourselves personally or of our culture. And when we do that, we're actually damaging ourselves.
That's right, and that's where the trauma shows. So we called it hysteria, but you can call it any form of neurosis, and that's where it's showing up in the cellular memory. It's showing up in the anxiety of the nervous system. Psychopharmaceuticals have become so prevalent in our culture.
Yeah. And it's true that these depth psychologies, which involve years of weekly sessions, lying on a couch and reporting your free associations, reporting your dreams, that is so out of fashion now, largely because insurance companies won't pay for it.
That's right. You go in for a 15-minute consultation and they give you a red pill or the blue pill. Yeah. That's very true, yes. And also, I want to clarify, Jung is active imagination. Free association is more Freudian, but in Jung, it's active imagination.
How
That's
do you distinguish between them?
He turned it. There isn't really a huge distinction, except in words, but in active imagination, you let your mind really run freely to see and communicate with whatever images of the unconscious want to come forward and dialogue with you.
Now, one of the interesting applications, I'm jumping around a bit, but I want to come back to synchronicity for a moment, because Jung, for example, wrote a preface to Richard Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching, the Chinese book of divination. And Jung surmised that to the extent that divination works, it's probably because the principle of synchronicity is at play.
Right, at play at the heart of life.
Yeah.
I believe they called it the Archimedean point. Jung felt that if this idea of synchronicity really took hold, it would upend our human ideas of reality.
And I suppose as a parapsychologist, it's fair to say that there are some people who theorize that maybe our models are wrong, maybe extrasensory perception, for example, implying that there's some sort of a organ of perception and some sort of information channel whereby information from the distant locations or in space and in time get transmitted to the human brain, that maybe that whole way of thinking, as appealing as it may seem, is wrong, that the synchronistic model of Jung might provide a better explanation.
Well, that's right, because maybe there is no distance. Maybe it's holographic, and therefore everything's enfolded. It's not even coming from a distance. It's actually coming out of cells, out of DNA, out of some sort of energetic expression that we tap into.
And that our common sense notion of the separation between me and the rest of the world is an illusion.
That's right. It definitely falls on its face, if you will, if synchronicity is reality.
Yeah. I believe, if I recall correctly, in my sophomore course on personality theories, the professor did give a lecture on Jung, and he said that Jung felt that some of his ideas were so dangerous and threatening that he didn't even want to publish them at all.
That could be, because a lot of Jung's work is heretical in a sense.
Yeah.
Coming from the Swiss Reformed Church, God is outside. Yeah. Jung took God and placed him inside the human psyche. And then he developed this individuation process, and he said, you know, man's becoming God. That's very heretical, still today, let alone for the time in which he did it.
It's heretical because it has a religious overtone, so that the scientifically minded people want nothing to do with it, and the religiously minded people also see it as a heresy comparable to Gnosticism.
That's right. And if it is true, then the power is really within us to change the paradigm, if you will. So it becomes very threatening to those the structures of Orthodox science and Orthodox religion.
Well, it's interesting because, as we pointed out earlier, Jung is so marginalized, and yet in spite of that, his influence throughout our culture seems to be quite pervasive.
Pervasive, and also for religious scholars. He's very, very influential to religious scholars. And I know you mentioned artists as well. Yeah, fringe psychologists, depth psychologists.
It's as if, you know, people appreciate the concept of synchronicity, the concept of archetypes, the idea that our lives are guided by our own personal and cultural myths.
I would say it's like water to a sponge. That when we really understand the points that Jung was trying to bring forward, a sense of healing. I mean, that was what he was about. He was about healing the suffering that he himself was going through, and also his culture at that time. And when we really understand that synchronicity helps alleviate some of that pain, that we can rest in this idea that all is arising synchronistically, then we heal.
Well, Dr. Leanne Whitney, thank you so much for sharing this fascinating and enlightening discussion about Carl Jung and his work.
Thank you, Jeff.
And thank you for being with us.